So we are going to jump right into our next panel discussion on food security and insecurity. Let me start by announcing and introducing our panelists who have helpfully arranged themselves in the order I was going to introduce them anyway. Starting with our moderator, Cullen. She's the host of CBC's award-winning political program, The House, on CBC Radio and CBC Listen. You can listen on Saturday mornings on CBC Radio or download the podcast at any time. Next to her, Dr. Andrew Powell has been based in Singapore for over 30 years and is the CEO of Asia BioBusiness Limited. He's worked as a consultant since 1995, primarily focusing on the agriculture and food sectors. His projects have included agri-food sector policy, food security, ag tech, and food tech, and the management of open innovation systems. Next to him is Dick Fadden, who is the National Security and Intelligence Advisor to both Prime Minister Harper and Trudeau. Prior to that, he was the Deputy Minister at National Defence and also served as the Director of the Canadian Security and Intelligence Service, in addition to being a member of the Canadian Global Affairs Institute's Advisory Council. And last but not least, next to me, Ambassador Michel Miraillet, the Ambassador of France to Canada. Prior to becoming Ambassador to Canada, he was the Director General for Global Affairs of the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the G7, G20 Sous Sherpa. He's also previously served as the ambassador to Brazil and to the United Arab Emirates. Catherine.
Well, it is going to be difficult to compete with the image of a giant cardboard cutout of Lawrence Macaulay, but we're going to try. Before we get down to business, I do want to let you all in on something, which is when I started on Parliament Hill in 2014, I spent a lot of time chasing Richard Fadden around with the microphone, so I am really delighted to have him in particular, but all of our panelists on stage today to talk a bit about these issues. And Richard, I do want to start with you, not just because I have this opportunity. No, all right. Thank you. I think you can. Yeah. It starts with drama. Wonderful. Take that, Lawrence Macaulay. I'm going to put it on the table here. So, Richard, when we look at these issues, when you look at the issue of food insecurity and security, I mean, I didn't look at a single source about this that didn't talk about the relationship, how one begets the other, right? We see that there is conflict and it leads to hunger. We see that there's hunger and it leads to conflict. We know that this is something that has been true for a very long time. When you look at the globe right now, where do you see an instance of this relationship between food insecurity and security that you think is particularly relevant to Canada?
Let me start by just taking 30 seconds, because probably not absolutely everybody in this room wakes up every morning and thinks about national security. I know that's hard to believe, but national security has two components: what happens here and what happens around the world. And both are equally important, and something that we tend to forget a little bit. And to pick up a point that Goldie was making earlier, national security and economic security are not the same thing, but they are certainly very, very, very much linked. So when I start thinking about these things, I think what worries me the most is the relationship between food, water, and climate change. We tend to forget in this country that there are a significant number of countries where people are basically starving day in, day out. If you get enough people in a particular country beginning to starve, this gives rise to public order issues. People riot, people get very upset, people want to move. And beyond a certain point, you end up with national security issues because they cross borders when people don't want them to cross borders. We've seen this in any number of circumstances. So I think the real worries today are largely in parts of the Middle East and Africa. But equally important to that, though, is the importance of global supply chains in terms of food. Think about what would happen if the Straits of Malacca were just closed down for 2 months. I mean, not likely. Or think what would happen if in Canada our critical infrastructure started just going kaflooey. Everybody in this room works for an industry that relies on our critical infrastructure. And I would be willing to wager that most of you don't think about this in the slightest. Or you have a crisis, you resolve it, and then you start thinking about it. Nobody has contingency plans. Nobody has a plan B to deal with these things. There are a lot of, never mind just insecurity, qua insecurity, there are a lot of really bad guys on this planet right now. There are states, there are terrorist groups, there are criminal groups, all of whom could very, very easily, if they wanted to make a point, and they do in some parts of the world, is interrupt the flow of food, interrupt the access to water. So I don't think there's a particular area, but I think if you look at the globe generally right now, added on to geopolitical insecurity, you could almost pick any part of the world. I mean, we don't think about it much, but think about Central America. A lot of geopolitical insecurity, but they also have trouble feeding themselves safely. So I'll stop there.
Okay, and just you make an important point about considering the context of all of this, and I'm sure many people in this room know this, but that for about 2 decades we were doing quite well fighting global hunger, and then since about 2015 we've seen the numbers get dramatically worse, and I can see a lot of heads nodding. 82 countries facing worsening food insecurity, 345 million people, which is just, I think, fundamentally incomprehensible for a lot of us. Ambassador Miraillet, I know that your background is a significant part of it is in the defense sphere. How do you think about these issues more broadly?
Well, I would say that more broadly, I mean, I totally agree to what was said previously. I mean, what we see is just that this question of food security is at the forefront of the destabilization of Africa. And this Africa may be not, I mean, the main target of the Canadian diplomacy. And if I may say, start by a nasty point, I would say we are still waiting Canada in Africa. And now when you're looking for the food insecurity situation, you can see that in the Central African Republic, in Congo, in Ethiopia, and South Sudan, the situation is getting worse and worse. And that's exactly what pushes us, I mean, to start with something we may talk about later, which is the farm initiative and a kind of roadmap to solve in the next decade, to try to solve in the next decade what is at stake in terms of food security. On the other hand, I mean, Africa is not the only place. I mean, look at the situation of Yemen, which is a terrible one, and where nobody is doing anything except an instrument, I mean, which should be proud about. I mean, it's a good thing it's a good joke to laugh about the UN inefficiency, but if there's an agency with UNICEF who's working hard, and is the World Food Program. And I would like to seize this opportunity again to put them under the limelight, because they did a really great job. And I mean, Canada is funding, of course, the World Food Program, but we need to do more. It's not, I mean, you can finance the World Food Program, but there's more to do, I mean, for the future, for the development of sustainable agricultural economy in what we call now the Big South. But in terms of generation, the linkage between water insecurity, food security, all the ingredients are there to multiply the zones of instability in Africa. You mentioned it in the Central America, in the Middle East, and as well as in the Central Asia. Look at what the situation now in Afghanistan. Look at the situation in Pakistan. We have all the ingredients for new conflicts to come there.
Andrew, I do want to bring you in here to just talk about what it is exactly we're talking about when we talk about food insecurity.
Well, let me sort of build on what you were saying there. We look at food security as having 4 dimensions: availability dimension, physical access dimension, economic access dimension, and a utilization dimension. Availability is the production, the growing of your crops. The physical access is what we've been talking about a lot today, is trade. The economic access is about GDP per capita, support systems within government to allow people to buy food. And the utilization dimension is a bit of a grab bag of nutritional security, which is extremely important in my part of the world. Waste, authenticity of your food products. So food security, as we heard earlier on, is very complex, and we see it as having a multidimensional nature. I'm interested to talk about later, perhaps about Southeast Asia, because I think we do have some real problems from a security issue. We haven't seen the strife that we saw in North Africa in the late noughties, but we have seen isolated incidents in Malaysia around sugar prices, cooking oil prices in Indonesia, and some contribution to food security to the disorder that we're seeing on the borders of Myanmar and India and Bangladesh. So, you know, we'll go into a bit more detail later on about Southeast Asia, but definitely a challenge.
I'm curious, when you identify those 4 aspects of this, obviously we need to address all 4 of them, but do you see one as being like the principal source of the issue right now?
Well, I think it varies from country to country. You know, 10 years ago, we did a large study of food security policy in APEC, and the rice-producing countries in East Asia, the Pacific Rim, they equated food security as rice production. And rice production doesn't necessarily provide nutritional security. Rice is not very good from a nutritional standpoint. So they also thought about rice production as being a self-sufficiency issue. If we can produce all our rice, we're going to be great. We don't need to worry about anything. But take themselves out of the trade system is extremely risky. And we saw that in the Philippines and Vietnam and Thailand. Other countries like Singapore is a bit unique. We import 90% of our foods, and we're trying to get to 30% of our nutritional needs by 2030, the so-called 30 by 30 program. We've got all kinds of programs, we can talk about that, but it's very varied around the region. Indonesia is a particular challenge with respect to the supply of wheat from Ukraine. They love their instant noodles in Indonesia, and that's where Ukraine provides the wheat for. So yeah, it's very varied around the region, but there are definite concerns with respect to food insecurity in most of the countries of the region. Thailand is nutritional security in the northeast, stunting, iron deficiency, zinc deficiency, folic acid deficiency, real serious problem, because it leads to mental retardation as well.
Richard?
I was just going to add a little bit. I don't know if any of you remember the American movie, The Shoes of the Fisherman. It's about a Ukrainian cardinal who became pope, and he eventually ended up trying to mediate between a China that was going hungry because of crop failures, and which was prepared to invade neighboring countries, and Russia, which was trying to help. I was looking at some material over the course of the last couple of days, and several emperors in China lost the mandate of heaven because they could not feed their people. I make this point because it still applies today. Think in particular, for example, of Egypt. Food there is subsidized to a point that we can barely imagine in this country. If they do not feed their people, they will revolt. Remember how unstable the Middle East is generally. There are a bunch of other countries, building on your point, Yemen, Somalia, a few others, they couldn't feed themselves for all the tea in China in short of 10 or 15 years. So there's a real responsibility and need for the likes of Canada and other countries to contribute to the UN programs you were talking about and others. Because in the end, I would argue, what was the chap's name? Maslow. So you remember air, water, food? In the end, if you cannot feed yourselves and there's a large enough number of people and you have groupthink encouraged by social media, borders are of no import. They will run through borders. If you do that too frequently, it's called a revolution. Governments get all upset, they start shooting people, and you have a national security issue from my more traditional perspective. But it's all based in the end on the ability of people to find drinking water and food. And there are significant parts of the world, as both my colleagues were saying, where that simply is not the case today. Last point, at least 2 nuclear powers, North Korea and Pakistan, have significant problems feeding their people. They're not the most stable bunch of people on this planet. So can you just imagine all of a sudden, they start saying, we can't feed our people, we have to do something, and they start threatening the use of tactical nuclear weapons. It may seem inconceivable, but if you think about it for a few minutes, it's not beyond the realm of the possible. Not necessarily that they would use the weapons, but they would threaten to do so, and they would give diplomats like the ambassadors one hell of a lot of work to do in very, very short order.
I definitely want to get to solutions in a moment with you, Ambassador Miraillet, but I'm just curious, Richard, I mean, you sort of lay out the moral imperative and the, I suppose in some extent, the survival imperative there, but given the scenario that you just described, like where does Where does Canada think of itself in the context of that? Is that just something that we're watching play out? We're trying to, plug the holes in the dam in the worst instances. How does Canada fit into that?
I don't think we think about it enough, to be perfectly honest. I think there are three components to what we could do about all of this. One is what we're spending on development and on humanitarian aid. And, our budgets in these areas have not significantly varied over the course of the last little while. Our tendency today is to simply write checks to the World Food Program and other institutions like that. Nothing wrong with that in and of themselves. But if you look at all the policies that we've put forward, and I'm not directing this at Mr. Trudeau's government in particular, the last several governments have not done this. We will pull ourselves together, help when there's a real humanitarian crisis relating to food, and then we'll forget about it. And it brings to mind the old adage, I can either give a guy a fish or I can teach him how to fish. Well, what we're doing with humanitarian aid is dealing with the problem in the short term, but we're not helping them deal with it in the longer term. So on the development side, I don't think we're doing as much as we can. On the trade side and the economic side, others are far more equipped than I am to deal with it, but I don't think it's an important component of our policies to encourage actively, sometimes with government support, sometimes without, movement of food and foodstuffs around the planet. And lastly, I think there's a role for diplomats to sort of try and poke and prod international institutions, to try and encourage trade between countries, to try and encourage countries in Asia or the Middle East or elsewhere to cooperate more than they are now to move food between themselves.
Okay. Ambassador, do you want to pick up on any of that? And I also will
Yes,
ask you
I just wanted to add to, I can agree to everything what was said, but there's one point I would just add is that the picture of global food insecurity is moving. The deep part of Africa, we still have that. Ethiopia is importing 50% of its wheat from Ukraine. Egypt, you mentioned it, but you have another country like Lebanon. Lebanon now, one time the richest country of the Middle East, is just importing 100% and relying upon the World Food Program at 100%. Can you imagine the disaster due to it? So those things may evolve again, and we need to look at it. And the problem is, the Ukraine crisis, the Russian aggression has just put the limelights on the situation people were not really aware of. The fact that some North African countries, which have developed economies, were relying upon at 80% on the imports of Ukraine wheat. And as you mentioned it's for us, for the European, what's going on in the Mediterranean has a huge importance for us. The Egyptian model, we know what happened with the green revolutions, a few years ago. But we were, 2 years ago, at the verge of such new eruptions of violence in Tunisia, in Algeria. So, we need to keep in mind that, the picture is not a fixed one. And it goes more in the sense of worsening year after year.
Let's talk a bit about solutions, because obviously if a changing picture, it's still an alarming one. And let's talk about the farm initiative, food agricultural resilience mission that France is behind. Can you tell us a bit about how this aims to address some of what we're talking about?
Well, I'm not sure that the French initiative taken in March 2022 is the solution. Sorry to say, but coming from French diplomat, but we need to be more modest on this. I think that what we try to put on the table was more roadmap to increase, a situation on the short term where the situation was how to accelerate delivery of food in those countries who were just needed it. I mean, and one more time, the situation didn't start with the Ukraine crisis. The Ukraine crisis was just an accelerator. But you know, when you know that the south part of Madagascar is still an hungry part of the world, in Madagascar, I mean, those are situations everybody knows something about South Sudan or Ethiopia, but nobody knows the situation in the Central African Republic for a moment. So what we try to do is to put on the, to design a kind of framework with 3 pillars. A pillar looking for, delivery of food as soon as possible in order to prevent, some behaviors. And we need to keep in mind that some countries, like China, are trying to accumulate stockpiles. And you have other countries where who have to fight with their own public who just refuse, like India, to see wheat exported, you know, but now we have those 3 pillars. The first one, which is the one which we try to have some success, was to do, can I say that, to maintain the stability and transparency in agricultural markets. So it was a question of prices, available stocks. During a former French presidency of the G7, we designed an instrument called AMIS, was supposed a platform which was supposed to accumulate all the information on the stockpiles and the productions everywhere. 2 main countries are not participating to that, China and India. So you can see that there's a lot of work to do now. The second pillar was how to strengthen solidarity with the most vulnerable countries. And the third one was investing in sustainable local production to increase the resilience of food systems in the most vulnerable countries. Because the solution is not, I would say, a US or Canadian solution. You know, you have a problem, we just send millions of tons of wheat. What is important is to build the elements of a sustainable situation. I mean, how to develop something. That's exactly what we did with the Great Green Wall Initiative in Africa, in order to transform completely the economy of those African countries. We have another, and it means, you know, fighting against the danger of seeing huge amounts of wheat or soya coming from Brazil, from the big producer, and, you know, in erasing the capability of local producers. And you have to rebuild an economy, an agricultural economy around it. And those are the three points. On the pillar 1, we succeeded in June 2022 at the WTO with an agreement on preventing, you know, embargoes on delivery of foods. I mean, it was a huge success. On the question of solidarity, we try to launch, and I think that we organized some exercise last year in most of the allied country, just to raise the attention of the private business, to which extent they could do something on the basis of call for tenders issued by the World Food Programme for some countries. It took some time because it's a delicate issue, but what we are trying now, we are waiting the WFP to issue those tenders to see how some companies, not only producers, but companies like Total or shipping companies may do a part of their job, you know. Those are the three pillars. But the third one, where we are working with IFAD, is just to try to transform country by country. It's a very long-standing policy to be followed. And that's exactly the kind of things where, for example, the Canadian industry may play some role, how to develop some crops, you know, for desert situations and blah, blah. So I mean, it's not a solution, it's just a roadmap.
Okay. Andrew, I want you to talk a little bit about solutions too, but given that we have so many folks here who come from an industry perspective, as you talk about some examples of successes you've seen, I wonder if you can sort of engage with this idea about how much of those solutions are politically driven versus driven more by the private sector.
I don't think either one of those has the solution, and I think it's very important that we get everybody working together. Food security is a complex problem, and we need it's a multi-sectoral, multi-stakeholder solution that we need. That is pretty darn challenging. One of the multinationals requested my company to develop a program about 3 years ago, and we worked on behalf of the multinational to create a stakeholder group. We had groups like the Stockholm Environmental Institute, we had DFAT Australia, we had Olam, the big trading company, and with activities in Asia and Africa. Airbus Industries expressed interest. Practically everybody I talked to was really keen to be part of that initiative. We were calling it a center of excellence, for want of a better expression. We got farther and farther down the line to see the problems developing, in that the people we talked with in the multinational were really keen to go ahead, but the lawyers in the multinational started putting in the requirements of agreements with all the stakeholders who are going to be around the table. It became more and more problematic, where governments would say, well, can't sign an agreement with a multinational like that, or one of the NGOs were, oh, we're not really keen on signing something with the multinational. And then ASEAN go, ooh, we're not really used to working with multinationals. And you go, oh, we didn't get anywhere really. And I think, listening to what you're talking about, Ambassador, I think our approach was wrong. I think it might be a country initiative that brings people together rather than an industry initiative that brings people together. So we don't have this stigma of industry, and oh, it's vested interest here, you're going to create dependency, et cetera, et cetera. That's not what we wanted to do.
It must be wildly frustrating to have.
You can say that again.
That's a yes, yeah.
Because we had all the people around the table, and what it was just basically a clearinghouse for technology. And I was really keen on getting Canadian technology into Southeast Asia. And we would be a clearinghouse for that technology, but a fine-tuning area for that technology, because big ag from Canada is not going to work. Big ag solutions are not going to work too well in my part of the world. We've got smallholder farmers on 2 hectares or less, but we've got 300 million of them. So if you can find solutions for these kind of guys, you will make money. We're not going to be talking about millions from or thousands from each farmer, but a couple of bucks here and there from these smallholder farmers, you start to make some money. It was very frustrating, but there are opportunities if we can get the mindset around this big challenge and get people working together.
And you're saying fundamentally you think that that's going to have to come more from governments?
Well, I'm just thinking that it might be, because it didn't come from the multinationals. That multinationals have got really good intentions, and we've worked with probably all the big 4 or 5 over the years. Syngenta on the Rice Bowl Index and others. So, it was very, very super exciting, because everybody wanted to be a part of it from all kinds of different sectors. They saw that it was not one sector could solve it. DFAT Australia were particularly supportive of us, and still are, in trying to get something going. But
can I just add a thought or two to that? I think we have 2 issues here. I'm a lapsed lawyer, so I can say this. I think lawyers have far too large a role in dealing with a lot of these issues. They have effectively, in a lot of areas, gridlock progress. I mean, lawyers are a good thing, but it's reached the point now that you can't have an agreement between a company and a subnational group without having one of the larger law firms on the planet, spend 6.5 years working through the 600-page document that's needed. So, but that's just, I really do think on a lot of areas we are giving too much attention to lawyers.
You didn't get booed by any lawyers saying that.
That's
very impressive.
True. But the other point I wanted to make was, I think one of the big problems, going back to your question about what Canada can do, is we are particularly bad at looking at the medium and long term. Not just in this area, but generally. I mean, part of it, democracies have this problem to begin with, because there's an election process and whatnot, but I think we're really bad at it. And I don't know what the solution is, but if you look at what our governments have done over the last decade or so, they deal with the problem of the day, maybe of the week. And the problems that we've all been talking about require thinking forward 10 or 15 years and then developing a plan to do them. I don't think there are many of those plans in the government of Canada. And as one illustration of that, I would argue that one of the big policy issues for Canada in the next 20 years will be, how are we going to respond to the United States' request to divert significant amounts of water as the California aquifers are drying up? This is not water in bottles, just to be clear. This is, the Fraser River ain't what it used to be. At some point, that's going to have a significant capacity on the US's ability to create food, and it's going to have an impact on ours. And I would be willing to wager a decent lunch that not very many people in either think tanks or in the government are thinking about this. And if you do a bit of research on this, water has become a significant issue, despite the deluges they've been enduring over the last few days. Significant issue in the United States, large parts of the United States, and the only place they're going to get it is from this country and diverting a significant volume of water. I'm not saying we shouldn't do it, but we sure as heck shouldn't wait until they start coming and asking for it. We should think about it and what it will mean for agriculture throughout the continent and water supplies throughout the continent. Longer term thinking, we really need more of.
Do you think then that it is a necessity that we are only going to ultimately realistically engage with these issues from a government perspective when we're on the doorstep of a crisis? Or do you think that there is a way, be it economic opportunity or something else, to incentivize addressing this sooner rather than later?
That's a good question, and I don't have an answer except to say that if we find a way to do it, it's going to be novel because we're really not very good at it. But I think it's a good example of an area where you can have civil society, the private sector, and governments works together. And all it really takes some time is somebody who's willing to spend some political capital in one of those three. And in this country, that's hard to get people to do unless there's an immediate possibility of a return. It's a problem in democracies everywhere. But our ability to forget about what's going on in the world is unbelievable. The ambassador mentioned Lebanon. It is barely a state. They have to import all of their food. They could well just go to pieces very, very shortly. And remember the other countries that are in that general area. It could mean a blow up in the Middle East, generally speaking, which would have, implications not only for food, but for all sorts of other things. So I think think tanks, associations like the ones here, but also companies need to spend more time, I think, worrying about the medium and long term. After I retired, I started sitting on a few commercial boards, which I find really quite interesting. And it's fascinating, the cultures. Some of them are fixated still today with the next quarter. Others are trying to think 15 years ahead. We need more companies that think 15 years ahead and try and get governments to do the same, along with UN agencies, which are better at thinking about the long term, but seem to have difficulty operationalizing the thinking.
Ambassador, do you have any reflections on the challenges? I mean, I think it is easy in the context of this conversation to understand the immediacy of the threat, the deep level of concern. But of course, when you're sitting in the room where these decisions are being made, there are a lot of competing concerns and threats. What's your reflection on politically how this fits into the scheme of priorities?
Si vous me permettez de parler en français,
ça me dérange pas.
Would you allow me to speak French? No problem at all.
Would that be helpful, or vous allez?
I can switch
Okay,
again to
je peux faire un peu de
English. I'll
traduction
try to do
après.
it.
I can do a little bit of interpretation after that.
question est absolument
The issue is
fondamentale.
absolutely fundamental. And what my neighbor is very, very correct. And nowadays,
Le
feeling,
le sentiment qui est le
the
nôtre,
feeling that is ours indeed,
que cette situation
is that this situation
impose de plus en plus,
imposes
donner de plus en plus de
more
poids
and more
aux conversations que
shape
nous avons dans un
to
certain
the
nombre de
conversations
G7,
we have
le G20,
in
le G20
certain
de plus en plus fondamental.
areas, the G7, the G20, which is more
On
and
sait bien
more
qu'aujourd'hui, une
fundamental.
forme de secrétariat
And we must understand that
avec
today
effectivement
this is a secretariat of the G20
des
with
moyens de
more and more
réflexion, des
means
moyens d'analyse et
to
d'étude
think, to
fondamentaux.
analyze that
Pendant
are
2 ans et demi, j'ai
fundamental.
suivi
For 2.5 years, I followed all these files of the G7 and the G20, and I always saw an agreement that was very, very strong on the matters of Ukraine, of sovereignty of the UE, to make an export of Ukrainian products. All of this functioned very well. Today, it is true that there's no thinking in the G7 concerning the situation in 10 years. Today, more than ever, we see that, be it the agricultural world situation, be it the Indo-Pacific situation, we need a few channels of coordination, G7 or G20, the 1.5, as we call them, tracks, with research centers, and today this is a type of work that continues. There's nothing worse. I did written reports about the world in 2025, and when I read them today, I am ashamed because of the amount of things we did not see. But this reflection work on a permanent basis is essential to do business as far as security goes. You cannot abstain yourself from thinking about the Chinese when they want to tell you things, and there are other actors, the South Africans, for example. They don't think like us, Europeans, Americans, Latin Americans, and this is the effort we must make at the state level. And that means that track 1.5 are also companies, and that takes time to arrive in this type of dialogue.
Justice, I think, sir, but you were talking about he's talking about the importance of the G7, the G20. You talked about reports that you did some time ago that you spent years on that I guess causes you some chagrin to look back at now in terms of what wasn't done and the importance of consulting widely. You were talking both about with businesses, but also with other parts of the world. Is there anything crucial you think that I've missed there, Ambassador?
No.
Okay. It sounded much better when you said it, I will say.
But I mean, you didn't catch, I mean, it was not translated, I'm sorry. I could have, okay. So, okay.
Yeah, I just don't know how many folks in the room have headsets, but so fundamental, like, I guess the challenge I always find in these political discussions is that we lay out the problem so clearly. We say, okay, better reflection, more involvement of private industry, more on development. And I guess just we'll go around for a quick closing thought from everybody before we open up the floor for some questions. But how much faith should people in this room have that we can really get there, that kind of reflection, for instance, that you're talking about, that can really happen, or what would it take to really spur on the kind of change we need to see?
I think that in a sense, you need something like magic, change the Canadian mindset. I mean, you feel too comfortable in this country, and you have to look at the real world, what is outside. I mean, nobody cares in this country about the situation in Africa, except, I mean, the people of Rio Tinto and mining and a bunch of experts. But I mean, the Canadian middle class doesn't care about what's going on in Asia, in Central Asia. I mean, this is a question of, it's your job as a journalist. You need to raise the attention.
Well, I'm curious whether, I'm working very hard, I promise, but I'm curious whether you feel that's a specific condemnation of Canadians or sort of the Western world more broadly.
I mean, you have a graduation. But after 4 months in this wonderful country, I'm still surprised by a sense of comfort, in this place where you have everything: snow, comfort, electricity, water. Tim Hortons. I mean, I don't want to say that their coffee should be prohibited by the Geneva Convention, but really, I think that you have everything. I mean, the sense of comfort, and this country has been, in the middle of two huge or many wars, but now seems to be in a kind of comfort, which is in a sense dangerous. But this is just a very personal impression, you know, hard to feel. So, I mean, when you're talking about food insecurity, world instability, I mean, you need to be more present in Africa, definitely. I mean, Canada has a fantastic image, I mean, of a country close to, I mean, the right of individual rights. I mean, you have to go and fix new relationships with the African Union, for example. Go, I mean, in Asia, I mean, the Indo-Pacific strategy is good news now. But I mean, after that, you have a plan, and after that, you have to deliver.
Okay, we only have a few minutes left. Andrew, and then Richard, and then we'll open up the floor. Go ahead.
Let me perhaps just add to your comments. I think Canada's got a lot to offer, but we don't go out there and sell it enough. Over the 30 odd years I've been in Asia, we've had all kinds of initiatives announced by Canadian governments, all descriptions in Asia. They haven't really been sustained. And with this new Indo-Pacific policy, we really have to have sustained effort and commitment to that. You know, you're competing with some major players in the ag sector, not just France, Europeans, the Netherlands specifically. Australia has some incredible programs in Southeast Asia. And it's not just about trade. They're doing the soft, more economic diplomacy. They're developing, you know, research agreements. We have a CSIRO office in Singapore. In the late 90s, we had Arthur Carty from the NRC develop programs with Thailand. Thailand used the IRAP program as an example for their own particular programs in Thailand. And I hear that they're starting to talk to NRC again about other programs. University of Saskatchewan has a program in Bangladesh. We need more of those. It's not just about trade. Food security is a big, big problem and a complex problem. Let's go beyond. I mean, trade is great, don't get me wrong, but we've got other things to think about as well. I mean, other things we can do. We've got great technologies in Canada. If we translate them in the right way, they can be relevant for my part of the world. And I think, you know, there are opportunities there.
Richard?
Sorry.
I agree, but there's always a but. I mean, taking the Indo-Pacific strategy as an example, I think it's a good thing we have it. We should have had it a while ago. I was participating in another conference organized by CGAI the other day, so I spent a bit of time thinking about it, and there's a section in there that says, and Canada will pay special attention to 8 countries plus all the ASEAN countries. We're really, really bad in this country on prioritizing. We are appallingly bad at it. And I hear the ambassador when he says we should, you know, spend some time in Africa. I agree, because we have no colonial history. We speak French, we speak English. There's a reason. But we do not have the capacity to have a worldwide policy capable of delivery. We are not the G1. So one of my hobby horses is I don't think we're very good at self-analysis. We're a middle power, not as influential as we were even during the Cold War. So we need to rethink what we can do. I agree very much with what you were saying. Even in that context, there's a lot that we can do at the industry, the private sector level that we're not doing. But if we try and do too much, we will accomplish very little. And I think that's, not that we're here to criticize the Indo-Pacific strategy, but there's no prioritization. And we've got to prioritize if we're going to do some of the things that you're talking about.
I think there's a lot of really good things in the Indo-Pacific policy, the white paper. You know, the commitment to building partnerships with other research organizations in our region. Very, very good. Other people have done it, and there's real opportunities for Canada to do that.
We've got a couple of minutes left for questions, so if anybody would like to head to the microphones, wonderful. We'll see how many we can squeeze in. Sir?
Chris Davison with the Canola Council of Canada. Lots is being written and talked about in the context of trade, and trade is increasingly being talked about in the context of climate and environment policy. I'm curious what the panelists think, maybe it's a complex area obviously, but some simple suggestions or guidelines for what will inform good climate and environment policy so it's contributing to food security and not insecurity.
I will just say, the clock is ticking, so I'll ask for some concise answers, which I know is difficult given that it's a complex question.
I was going to point to him.
I was going to point to him.
No?
No. I don't have an answer to the question in substantive terms, but I think that A partial answer is, in this country, we have to talk about it publicly, in parliament, in the media, in think tanks, and with industry, because we tend not to talk about problems of the sort that you're dealing with. It's one of my hobby horses about national security. We never talk about it, except when there's a crisis, then we promptly forget about it. But the issue that you're raising is a really critical one. And I can't remember ever reading anything about it over the last little while. We need to talk about it and write about it and think about it.
I think that we did it. I think that we did it with the Africans and with this idea and this program of the green wall in the South Sahel, where we have a plan with the African Union and those countries to try to able. It doesn't mean that we will plant billions of trees, but on the contrary, that now we are now trying to modify the production structures, finding new crops, trying to develop a capacity of export to Europe. You know, I mean, look at for example, 30 years ago, people were not in New York, Upper East Side, were not eating bulgur or all those new cereals coming from Latin America, like quinoa. Now it's the Yuppies are eating that. You can really imagine that you may find new cereals in Africa, developing cereals, promote them in order to create, you know, a new export markets, and it goes with the credit, and it goes also with the food feeding for girls in schools and blah blah, an initiative we are heading with Canada, by the way. We're at the G20. So I mean, there are efforts and critical things, but I'm not surprised that this is not known really in Canada, because I mean, the lack of interest, or I would say, for Africa is still a question mark for me.
You have a question?
Yes, my name is Josue Kashama from the Canadian Produce Marketing Association. I have a question regarding the influence of Russia and China in Africa, and as well, for example, France. Tell me if you agree or not, but it finds that they have a very complicated relationship right now with Africa. The Burkina Faso, for example, just called back their ambassador, and the French army pulled out as well, Burkina Faso, and as well, I just want to see, because the West seems to care a lot about democracy, which is a good thing. But Russia and China, they don't care if there are dictators in Africa. And I think this plays in their favor, because they're able to give more foreign aid, for example. And oftentimes it's predatory. And we had seen, I think it's Scandinavian countries and Western countries in general, we have a lot of prerequisites if we want to give aids, for example. So I just want to see, with that growing influence and the Wagner Group, for example, in Central African Republic, how does Canada and its allies see themselves moving forward in Africa? And again, like I just said, it seems that French influence is declining in Africa.
I'll say we have a couple of extra minutes, and I think this is a terrific question. I'd like folks to engage with it. I remember going on a trip with this Prime Minister. We visited Ethiopia and Senegal, and in Ethiopia in particular, this was pre-pandemic, just seeing the signs everywhere of everything being built by the Chinese, and thinking like how pitifully our trip seemed in the face of influence like that. But who would like to, maybe, Richard, can I put you on the hot seat again, Russia, China in this picture?
Well, a couple of things. One, I think you're correct in the sense that Russia and China's dealings with countries in development are much, much looser than ours. I happen to think that we place too much emphasis in Canada on some of our values, which are not necessarily shared in countries where we want to have, with whom we wish to have dealings. And
Such as?
Our preoccupation with labor rights, our preoccupation with the rights of women, our preoccupation with Indigenous people. None of these are unimportant, absolutely important. But when you're going to a country that is either under a severe dictatorship, but whose people are starving, they do not want to be lectured by Canada. And I'm exaggerating to make my point. And it's also true of the European Union and the United States. There are all sorts of conditions. The other difference is today, China seems to have an unlimited amount of capital in order to invest in the developing world, whereas the West, if anything, it's being reduced. And I also think that China's foreign policy, if I can call it that, is one of active engagement with the view of acquiring influence of a not necessarily helpful part. I mean, large parts of the third world accused the United States of, in post-World War II, of trying to run the planet. Relatively speaking, they didn't do it. They just gave a lot of money and tried to help people. I think China's attitude is much, much more predatory, and that comes through. Russia today, I think, is trying to go back to the position it used to have and just trying to make trouble hither and yon. But I think the real difference is the West doesn't have the capital, and as the ambassador says, we do not have the interest. The United States is looking inwards more and more. We don't have the interest in Africa. I don't think we have a great deal of interest in other parts of the world as well. And the sad part is, we're talking about it now just in terms of I think, development, but it's in our interest, our economic interest, to see these parts of the world develop. And I come back to the point I was trying to make earlier. If we prioritized a little bit with our allies, I mean, Goldie's point much earlier this morning about blocks, well, maybe we should start having blocks to help with food development or the protection of water or whatnot, and we don't do that except through the UN agencies.
Ambassador?
Moi, je ferai la différence entre la Chine et la Russie.
I would like to make the difference between China and Russia. China is a very long-term policy of investment and of capturing the resources. We worked a lot on this file with an evolution, that is to say, to give more and more capital to be able to invest no matter what.
Okay, so I will switch. I will switch. I mean, the Chinese, they don't have any more. I mean, the amount of credit they had in the last 10 years.
But they have more than we do.
Yeah, but they were, of course, largely. But the impact has been the creation during the Trump administration of a new development bank, a huge one, able to confront the Chinese development bank. And the Europeans have also done the same thing with the European Development Bank. And now for the last 18 months, we are now developing another kind of offer for the Chinese. So the situation with Russia is very different because it is based on also captation of resources, of gangster behavior, I mean, in a sense. And let me tell you that, I mean, the situation has changed. We are no more in the 70s. We do not act in a post-colonial way. I mean, could have been very easy, I mean, to send 2 companies of French foreign legions, to bring the situation to square one in Burkina Faso or in the Central African Republic, where, I mean, the last 5 years were just horrible. And I mean, it's no more the case. And we have to assume the fact that if they ask us to leave Burkina Faso, where we were maintaining 800 special forces in order to combat those jihadist groups, and I don't know if you listened to the radio this morning, but I mean, there were all the new massacres there. I mean, we have to comply with that. But there will be a day where people will realize where they are. And the famous campaign against France has been totally orchestrated. You will be absolutely fascinated by what we see and what we intercept in terms of attempts, to decriminalize the situation of the French. Remember in Mali, for example, the so-called massacres, and then because our UAVs, took the picture of the Russians organizing it. This is an example, but there are others. The last ones were just saying that the French will have to be expelled from Burkina Faso because we were just captating the whole mining business in this country. just to remember that 54% of the mining revenues are made by Canadian companies, not a single French one. So, I mean, it's a very long process. I mean, we can't be satisfied. We are really alarmed. We are looking very closely to the situation, but what can you do? You know, I mean, if we intervene there, we will be summoned. How dare you French, you know, to come back with your old colonial habits? That's a price. And that's the meaning of our conversation with the African Union or with the regional cooperation. Okay. I fully agree. It's not a satisfying situation, but I mean, it's not the end of the day, I'm trying to say.
I think we can squeeze in at least one more question.
Je sais que le temps est court, alors donc je serai trop rapide. Non, c'est Patrick Gagnon.
I think there's a very short time. Patrick Gagnon.
Around here. So the question is that you're talking about food security and insecurity and trying to develop markets for Canadian products. And I'm from an agricultural background a long time ago as a kid. But what about the international organizations such as the Commonwealth or La Francophonie? I mean, Canada has limited resources. We have this big push towards Asia and whatnot, or at least we're looking at the G20 and others, but Canada has limited resources. So is there any way that we could probably re-engage these organizations which have been in place for more than 50 years, 60 years, and where the number of countries involved are in the billions? So there are 80 odd members of the Francophonie, and the same thing with the Commonwealth. So I was wondering if that's perhaps a track that we could take, given the limited resources that Canada has.
And given that we do engage, certainly politically, with them, right? We see the Prime Minister heading to La Francophonie,
from the military, from food, from whatever. Yeah. But given that they, as one of the earlier speakers said, very rapidly, 90% de la clientèle, c'est une clientèle connue.
80% of the clients are known. These are developed countries, and one have to see who would be interested by our services.
Let me talk about the Commonwealth, about which I know a little bit. Or I can talk about La Francophonie and you can do the Commonwealth. But, you know, there is a Commonwealth Development Fund. There are Commonwealth initiatives in order to promote trade between Commonwealth countries. But most of the Commonwealth today is made up of countries that are relatively quite poor and not in a great situation. I think it's worth trying to, you know, give them a shot of adrenaline. Same thing with La Francophonie. But while we're doing that and supporting a half dozen UN specialized agency, we're again doing what I would advocate we shouldn't do all the time, which is spread a little bit of money across too many efforts. But you're right when you imply that we have a special relationship with the countries of La Francophonie and the Commonwealth, and it would be worthwhile, if only to use them politically, to poke and to prod and to encourage the development of regional groupings and whatnot. If I had my way, which I never will, I would try and improve the UN agencies. Some of them are doing really very good work, but the UN generally is not the most efficient and effective organization on the planet, but they can be made better. Ambassador?
Oh, Andrew, well,
I'm not convinced the Commonwealth would be a particularly strong vehicle to use. I think it's a bit of an anachronism. Certainly in my part of the world, it's not really viewed that highly. Singapore is meh about the whole thing. Yeah, I wouldn't agree.
I find that very interesting. So therefore, we should probably pull out of the Commonwealth.
Well, I wouldn't go as far as doing that.
I mean, really show, you know.
But
same thing with the Francophonie.
Yeah. You know, it has a function, but I don't think it would have a role in this situation.
Okay, closing thought to you, Ambassador.
Thanks. For the Francophonie, I mean, this is not a kind of circles. I mean, I don't know if you have attended a meeting or summit of the Francophonie. In the sense, it's a mix. I mean, what is important is that in the corridors you may have bilaterals, and there you just look at the issues. And it's true that most of those countries during with the surge of the Ukrainian war just rushed and used those meetings. But as such, as a topic for the matter, no. G7, G20, yes, and I can tell you that Canada played its role in those circumstances. But what is at stake there, if we come back to food security, is the role of regional organization, like for the COVID-19. Don't take the African Union as a group of countries unorganized, not at all. They have regional organization, they do what they want, they have, and they need to be taken seriously, which is not the case of East Asia. I mean, ASEAN is still a big thing, you know, but African Union, no, they have agencies. And I just would like just to finish by what I said earlier, is that, I mean, like UNICEF, the World Food Program, I mean, has to be sustained, supported, because they are just doing a great job.
Excellent. Thank you all very much. It's a really insightful conversation. Appreciate it, Dave.
Please join me in thanking everyone.
I'm afraid we didn't solve the problem.
Okay, as some of you may actually be able to smell, lunch is now here.